Our country's quadrennial presidential election is the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the World Series of our democracy. Of course, the election is a lot more than a game. The stakes are much, much higher. To help us think about what's at stake in the election, we've again brought together Bob Creamer and Chris Robling. They're veteran political consultants and activists, one a Democrat, one a Republican, dating back to 1992. This is their 7th time with the Ethical Society. Okay? Here are the rules of engagement. Each speaker has an initial 15 minutes. We'll then have a short musical interlude to be followed by a short question and answer period. In 2012, Bob Creamer spoke first, so this time we've asked Chris Robling to lead off, for better or for worse. Chris Robling is a conservative Republican consultant who was raised by a family of FDR-supporting New Deal Democrats. He tells me that he switched parties between 1972, while he was an exchange student in Finland, and 1976, after hearing Jimmy Carter's acceptance speech. In the many years since then, Chris has become an activist GOPer, serving as a congressional aide, campaign gypsy, party executive director, and commissioner of elections here in Chicago. He's been a radio and TV political commentator on WGN, WMAQ, WIND, WTTW, Fox, CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Chris has also worked with many companies as a crisis consultant. He studied at Georgetown University and Northwestern University Law School. So once again, please welcome Chris Robling.
Thank you, Alan. Your Honor. All right, it's good to be back with Bob, and good to be with all of you. Thank you very much for having me back. I would really like to make a special point about Alan and how much I think both of us look forward to his phone call, to his email that comes in the spring of the presidential years. And now that this is our 7th, we've gotten used to it, and it's been a privilege from the very start, which for those of you who are relatively new to the group actually took place over in Evanston before you had this nice new home and facility that you've, I would say, adapted so well to your activity. Hi, up there. Hi, Everett. Hi. I also want to thank Katie Wachowson for that lovely selection. Where's Katie? Where'd she go? She's back there someplace. Thank you. Is she up there? Thank you. Oh, there you are. Hi. Thanks so much. So I've got my little, I actually downloaded the new software, and my phone has never been the same since I did that. Do you have that? But I have figured out that I can do this. I'm going to go over to clock, and then you set, I'm going to do 12 minutes start, and now I know how much time I have with you before we give it over to my colleague and friend, Bob. I think that Alan's citation of the ethical humanist ideal and prospect is very apt. I come from a religious background, actually, and I think that folks, believers in a society such as ours, in a liberal democratic society, small l, small d, always have a responsibility to assess the extent to which their views and their views in the public square are being promoted on bases which are accessible to all, as opposed to bases which are accessible only to their creedal cohorts. And that's something I bear in mind all of the time. And yet I also think of all of us, believer or non-believer, agnostic or atheist or deist or theist, as pilgrims on a journey about society and about the well-ordered society and how we are going to allocate the resources that we produce for the benefit of all. And that's why I began to question things when I was in Finland, as Alan pointed out, because I was having personal experiences with Finnish grandmothers who had woken up one day in 1939 with the Soviet Red Army in their front yard. And for a kid from Winnetka, that was a new experience. And I listened very closely to them. In fact, my AFS, I was an AFS field exchange student, and so my AFS family had such a grandmother, and she had her friends, and that's how I was sort of introduced to the reality of, I guess you have to say, power politics and realpolitik and the tough world in which we find ourselves, and the precious gift that we have from our heroes, our veterans, those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice, and indeed going back to the founders of this great republic. And that's where I began to think, maybe there's another way of looking at things that is distinct from how I had been raised. And I say that specifically because the Finns were univocal in saying, no matter what else happens in 1972, President Nixon has to be reelected, because only President Nixon in the entire world has the ability to deal with Leonid Brezhnev. And we in Finland hope that Nixon is elected because Brezhnev determines whether or not the Soviet Red Army comes into our front yards again. And I then sort of went on my own pilgrimage, and I started reevaluating the ways in which I saw the Democratic Party allocating resources and what it was doing. And this was a time of high-rises on the South Side, which were becoming criminogenic, I think, centers. And these are places where subsequently, when I became Commissioner of Elections, I would go into those very high-rises before Mayor Daley's changes to public housing brought them down and gave all of our public housing residents a new prospect, a new opportunity at life. But I administered elections in those high-rises when I became election commissioner. So there was nary a one into which I did not go and which I did not personally experience, sometimes on the first floor, which is where the polling places were, but sometimes on the 8th floor or the 12th floor, which is where the judges of election lived. And I have to say, taking my big brother down to the University of Chicago on Sunday afternoons after he would spend have meal with us up here and then he'd go back to the university, I was more and more despondent about what was going on. I say this to you because I didn't become a Republican overnight, nor did I become a Republican on some sort of whimsy. It meant a lot to me because it expressed a role in society for government, a role in society in which government was limited. And, I got into Northwestern Law School, but Bob went to Duke Law School, so he's smarter than I am. But I'll tell you that structural federalism and the separation of powers are two of the greatest gifts that we ever received from anyone. And not only structural federalism, but the sort of elaborated federalism of the Bill of Rights, which of course came after the Constitution and has its own, and by the way, the Bill of Rights deserves a biography, and I keep waiting for one of our great constitutional scholars to write the biography of the Bill of Rights, because it has its own gestation, it has its own anticipation and gestation and birth, and then it has a tough infancy, and you know, we're seeing the adolescence of it even as we speak today. And all of these elements, structural federalism, the Bill of Rights, the separation of powers, all of that is intended to keep a limit, okay, on government, a limit on how much the federal government can do, and to express I would say, a gracious respect for what people can do in states. Now, that's not to say that federalism is always right, and it's not to say that states always pursue the best idea. I'm not saying that. But it's a question of creating a framework. And that philosophical framework, that legal framework, that societal framework, the governmental framework, I think, is at stake in this election. Unfortunately, for a guy like me, you know, I'm confronted with the, I wouldn't say existential question, but the moral question of supporting a guy like Trump versus a person like Clinton. Now, you can imagine what I think of Clinton, and I don't want to go into, you know, the litany, right? I've got my litany. You probably know what it is. You've, you know, seen people like me on CNBC or CNN or Fox or someplace. And by the way, Alan left out, for all of you, my first standard radio gig in Chicago was with BEZ. Okay, so I have actually public radio in my background. But Trump is hardly recognizable to someone such as myself as a Republican. Okay? Trump is hardly Trump upholds almost none, I wouldn't say none, but very few. Ronald Reagan used to say, if you agree with me 80% or more, you're my ally. Okay, and that was just his rough and ready after the Sacramento battles that he went through and the sort of the political things that he went through to get the nomination between 68 and 80, and then coming into Congress. But he was always cordial with the folks who agreed with him 12% of the time, or 5%, like Tip O'Neill. But he had that sort of rough and ready. I think by that standard, if you employ that standard, and you look at traditional post-Reagan republicanism as an effort to increase efficiency, decrease cost, limit government, and provide a framework for the human flourishing that Alan described earlier, right? I don't know, Trump's somewhere in the 35 to 45% range, right? And that means that he's odd. He's profoundly odd. Now, this is before we get to the events of the tape and all this kind of stuff. But just, I want to tell you that as someone who made a conscious decision to stop being one way and to start being another way, okay, to critique what I saw on the Democratic side, which I consider to be, for lack of a better term, state of centralization, and to pursue the path of limited government, because I think that that is a better path for freedom and liberty and human flourishing than statist centralization. Okay, that's kind of where I am philosophically. And we might differ on that, but that's where I am. Anyway, a guy like Trump comes along, and we get a lot of notes that are discordant for Katie's benefit. Not to say flat, not to say sharp. They're different. They're not on the sheet music. And yet, my fellow Republican primary voters, state after state, primary after primary, debate after debate, I think expressed a frustration, not with Bob's friends, not with the Democrats, not with Barack Obama so much, or Hillary Clinton so much. The frustration that was being expressed relative to the Republican primary season was a frustration with our leadership in Washington, which is viewed, I think, by the rank and file out here in the regular world as having betrayed us. And so I'll say this and then hand it over to Bob. But the folks in the real world out here were told after 2 years of Obama and the passing of Obamacare in a way that we considered to be profoundly improper and potentially illegal, and I think it would have been illegal if John Roberts had followed his real beliefs, but he decided not to, quote, politicize the court. That's another whole conversation. But you look at the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and Republicans from Washington came out here and said, I say out here meaning the rest of the country, and they came out here and they said, you know what? Things are bad in Washington. Give us the House of Representatives, all will be well. I got to go. Things are bad in Washington. Give us the House. And gave them the House. Nothing changed. Then they came back 2 years later. Things are still bad in Washington. And thanks for the House. You give us the Senate, all will be well. Okay, all right. Really? Okay. Give them the Senate. Nothing's changed. And you know, I could be persnickety, and I knew Barack when I was Commissioner of Elections, and I think if he was here, you know, in the coffee hour afterward, he's the nicest guy you ever want to just chit-chat with. He's one of the most engaging. He's a very compelling figure. He's kind of a sweetheart, you know. He's a very good guy to talk basketball or whatever. So I could say, oh well, you know, Barack wouldn't work with the Republicans, and then Bob would say Republicans didn't work with. It's not. There's more at stake. There's more going on there. There's more going on there. Okay, but the Republicans were trying to express themselves at the House level. Then they were trying to express themselves at the Senate level. At the same time, we took over more governorships than we had had in, I don't know, 25 or 35 years, whatever it is. And the regular folks out there felt that however they interpret the difference between statism and limited government, they weren't being heard. They didn't get into the conversation. And that gestated, and it grew, and it fed upon itself. And folks were anticipating. So Scott Walker said, I'm the outsider from Madison. And Ted Cruz said, I'm the outsider from the Senate. I shut down the government. And, you know, these guys were competing to be the outsider, right? The chemical, the drug that'll go in and solve the disease, right? And they were essentially going back. They were saying what had been said about the House. They were saying what had been said about the Senate. And that's why the Republican primary voters said no. And Trump had already analyzed all of this from opinion research. So he came and said, I'm the real outsider. And they said, yes, you are the real outsider. And folks like me urged people as much as I could, because I'm at GN TV now and I'm at GN Radio, and I can't be like with one campaign. I can't be, oh, I'm with Carly or I'm with, you know, Ted Cruz or something like that. But I kept encouraging people not to vote for Trump. I kept encouraging, because we all know about the guy, right? But their anger and their antipathy and their revulsion at what had happened to them by their own leaders, by the Republican leaders in Washington, was so intense. They said, to heck with all of you, we're taking this matter into our own hands, and we see Trump and we're going to go with Trump. They were not adopting his view on women. They were not adopting his view that the Mexicans had selected the rapist to send across the line. They were adopting his status, not his views. His status as the outside antidote to the problem, okay? Which maybe we'll get to. But now my 15 minutes are up. Sayonara.
And after hearing from Chris Robling, it's Bob Creamer's turn. Bob is a graduate of Duke University and the University of Chicago. A liberal Democrat, he has been a political organizer and strategist for 4 decades. As a partner in the firm Democracy Partners, Bob has worked on many issue campaigns, including passage of universal health care, raising the minimum wage, stemming gun violence, and defeating efforts to privatize Social Security. He was a Democratic Party consultant in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections. Bob is married to Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and is the author of the recent book, Stand Up Straight, How Progressives Can Win. Please welcome Bob Creamer.
Okay. I'll do the same thing Chris did and set my iPhone here and see if that works. Thank you very much for inviting me. I totally agree with Chris that we look forward to this opportunity every 4 years, and does not seem possible. This is number 7 because of in terms of our age, which is considerably younger than. Yeah, right. Anyway, but it is a privilege every time to come talk with you. I think let me talk at the beginning about 2 different aspects of the Trump phenomenon. One is the kind of social and historic, and the other is the personal. And then I want to say a word about Hillary Clinton and why I believe she's so important that we elect Hillary Clinton in this election. My wife and I have had the privilege of being in Europe a couple of times for events or seminars this last year. And it is important to understand that the Trump phenomenon in the United States is not isolated to the United States. I mean, the rise of the authoritarian nationalist right is occurring both in the United States and in Europe, or has occurred in the United States and Europe, and I would argue for roughly the same reason in different variations. In the last 30 years, gross domestic product per person in the United States has increased 48%. That means if it were equally distributed, most Americans would be 48%, almost half again as well off as they were 30 years ago. In fact, that is not the case. In fact, median incomes in the United States are roughly the same as they were 30 years ago. And there was a notable exception of an increase in during the Clinton administration. And frankly, thank the Lord, there was an increase last year, for the first time since 2007. But bottom line is, all that money went somewhere. It did not go to immigrants. It did not go to poor people. It went to the top 1%. This is not a mystery. It's not a matter of theory. It's a matter of fact. That's whose incomes went up. Well, that creates the fertile ground for the unhappiness that Chris was describing in the Republican base, but around the country. That creates a sense that the system's not working for me. And that you see the same thing going on in Europe for roughly the same reason. And the consequence of that is that people tend to blame other causes. Same thing happened in the 1930s in many ways. Economically, not exactly, but the same kind of sense of economic malaise was played upon then and now by right-wing authoritarian nationalists. One of the scholars in the seminar we were attending in Poland actually said, there are all right-wing authoritarian nationalist movements share 4 characteristics. One is this grievance-driven nationalism. One is a narrative that the majority of people have been victimized by enemies, foreign and domestic. Third is the legitimation of conspiratorial thinking. And the final one is that only one strong man can come to the people's rescue. That was true of the movement that hoisted Mussolini to power, and the same is true with, frankly, Putin today. The same is true with Donald Trump. All of those characteristics characterize what his message to Americans. You know, in the 1930s, it was about Jews. It's kind of a small subset of the population. Trump, unfortunately, has managed to blame a great deal of the population. Women, African Americans, Hispanics, and so on, which is one of the reasons why he's having a problem right now. But we got to put in context historically what's going on here. Chris is right in one other way. I agree with you, Chris. This is not the traditional conservative movement, as much as I disagree with much of that. This is the alt-right. This is the right-wing nationalist authoritarian movement that characterizes its primary enemies as cultural and foreign. It's about xenophobia. It's about nationalism. It's about white supremacy in ways that the classic Republicans in the United States are not. And the same, by the way, is true of Europe. This is not the Tories in Britain. These are, you know, this is a much more nationalist movement in Britain. The same is true in France. It's not the Gaullists. These are this is Marie Le Pen. Now, in Europe, this thing has been fed in great measure by the migrations that were caused by the Iraq War, another wonderful George Bush policy. Frankly, the collapse of the Middle East. Here, it was rapists and murderers from Mexico. Here it is the other, which gets us to Donald Trump specifically. Trump is, I mean, let's say, not entirely perfect vessel for the right-wing nationalist movement in the United States, because he is, of course, in many respects characteristic of them, he is divisive. Is there any question? He started his campaign talking about rapists and murderers from Mexico. He has managed to, he is proud of his sexual harassment activities, laughing about them on tape. Unbelievable, really. I mean, we have a sign that says, "Make misogyny great again," right? I mean, he was a birther from the very beginning, trying to delegitimize the president based upon him being the other, an African, the first African-American president. So he's divisive. He's dangerous in terms of international policy. David Petraeus wrote an article, General Petraeus, for the Washington Post a couple months ago, entitled "Anti-Muslim Bigotry Aids ISIS Terrorists." It legitimates, I mean, Donald Trump is their greatest advertisement for recruitment around. He legitimates their narrative that the West is trying to destroy Islam and we're confronting a major battle of cultures, and Trump says that. His temperament. Donald Trump has the temperament of a 5-year-old. Most importantly, he has no ability to screen himself. And he reminds me of my 2 wonderful dogs. When you take them on a walk and you go down the street and there are squirrels, he cannot resist. They can't resist those squirrels. Now, some dogs can be trained to ignore them. Mine, unfortunately, and Donald Trump's has not. I mean, Alicia Mercado asked, what good did it do him rationally to attack her? What good did it do to attack Mr. Khan, one of the most dignified people to make a speech in the history of American political conventions? He can't help himself. Now, think about what that means about a guy in the Situation Room with more than a Twitter account. A man in control of nuclear arsenal. People forget, President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world in considerable measure, because he controls an arsenal capable of destroying humanity, literally. In one megaton bomb over a city like the size of Detroit kills 630 million people. Not million, pardon me, 1,000 people. That's a lot of people in a case. He is not a guy who you want to have his hand on the nuclear button, is he? Really? And finally, his biggest appeal, of course, is that he can stick up for ordinary people. Look at his record. It is not inconsistent, by the way. It's very consistent. His consistent principle has been what's good for Donald Trump. That's all. He will stiff you if you are a contractor. Sue me. And then you'll get your money less all those legal fees, maybe. He breaks unions. Not a friend of ordinary people. He's against a national right to work. He wants a national right to work law that weaken unions. He's against the national minimum wage. At least he was for a good portion of his campaign. I think he may have said something different now. But the bottom line is, this is a guy who's just basically out for himself. In fact, he is kind of emblematic of the way the system has been rigged against ordinary people. Not paying any income taxes, well, we don't know for sure, but I mean, having the ability to, against his so-called loss carry forward, you understand, it is emblematic of the way the system is rigged. A rich person who is an investor who loses almost $1 billion in the early 90s for 15 years under the current tax law can use that against any income down the road for 15 years and eliminate his tax obligation. If you are his employee who lost your job and have no income for a year, and then you get a new job, you can't deduct your loss last year against your income earned by working for a living. And the other thing is, the President of the United States is a symbol not only to the world of America, but to our kids. Donald Trump is a symbol of what we want our kids to be, an ethical person. I mean, what does that mean for bullying in the schools? What does it mean for the image of young women or young African-American men or Hispanics or whatever? This is not a person who wants to be, who we want to be our model. And the one thing I would maybe give heart to Chris with respect to this, Ryan, who's of course been struggling with his support for Trump, did make it clear last week if Trump were the president and they controlled the House and the Senate, the Republicans, they would use what's called the reconciliation process in Washington to eliminate Obamacare, meaning costing 20 million people their health insurance, and all of the consumer protections that went with Obamacare. He would pass tax cuts for the rich. He would do the full Republican program, force it through. So it's not like he is going to, and think about the Supreme Court, my friends. Supreme Court is right now on the precipice. It will either go one way or the other. It will either defend, because there are a bunch of people going to retire or die from the court. The next president will probably appoint 3 members to the court, including the one that has been obstructed for the last 9 months by the Republicans in the Senate. If Trump is the president, he will appoint the Supreme Court that will govern the laws of the United States and our rights for the next multiple generations. This is not just 4 years. The Supreme Court goes on for a long time. Hillary Clinton is a whole different ballgame. Granted, Hillary has, very shortcomings. All of us do. But she would be the most experienced candidate for president ever to be elected. She is running on the most progressive platform the Democratic Party has ever had, including the New Deal. She wants to build an economy that will work for everyone, not just the CEOs and the wealthy. And she would be the first president, female president in the history of the United States. So in closing, before I lose this part, let me just read to you. The Atlantic endorsed Hillary and against Trump. It's the third endorsement it has made in its history. The first one was for Abraham Lincoln. The second one was against Barry Goldwater. They felt constrained to endorse, but here's what they said about Donald Trump. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has no record of public service, no qualifications for public office. His aspect is that of an infomercial huckster. He traffics in conspiracy theories and racist invective. He is appallingly sexist. He is erratic, secretive, and xenophobic. He expresses admiration for authoritarian rulers and evidence authoritarian tendencies himself. He is easily goaded, a poor quality for someone seeking to control America's nuclear arsenal. He is an enemy of fact-based discourse. He is ignorant of and indifferent to the Constitution. He appears not to read. And now it's time. So that's my pitch. Okay. Thanks.
The most likely outcome of this election will be that we'll have a Democrat in the White House, a Republican in the House, and we don't quite know about the Senate. That configuration, to me, means nothing will change. I would like to hear your opinions on that. Thank you.
I guess that's directed to each of you. Please.
I hope things do change. I think that one of Bill Clinton's very admirable qualities was his ability to work with Democrats. I think that to work with Republicans, and I think that Bush tried to work with Democrats when possible. I think, let's not get into Barack and Mitch McConnell and all that kind of thing. I think that Hillary Clinton, if she is elected president, has a lot of all of this history and career in Washington. Part of that is a sense of the significance of both sides of the aisle and the need. And I hope that she pursues policies that can gain a majority that grounds government action in some dimension of a national consensus.
First off, when you talk about the Senate is very important. I mean, if the Senate goes Democratic, oh, thank you, Chris. Well, my seasonal allergy has nothing to do with pneumonia, though. I went to the doctor and checked, but if the Democrats control the Senate, it will make a massive difference in terms of the Supreme Court. I just want to be real clear about it. The Supreme Court is hugely important when it comes to everything from women's rights to voting rights to the rights of unions to organize. I mean, just any number of personal liberty, gun violence, all those questions. When it comes to these other questions, I do think Chris is right that that Hillary will do a good job of reaching out. Yeah, the president did a pretty good job of reaching out too. I mean, part of the message of the election will be: does right-wing nationalism have traction? If Trump is defeated soundly, that will be a huge help. I'm not giving up on the possibility we control this House too, although that's a stretch in this election. And the final point I would make is that one of the legacies of this cycle, I hope, is that the corporate elites in this country will have message sent that both because of the power of the Bernie campaign and the power of the Trump movement and the election in general, and certainly of the economic narrative that Hillary has adopted, there's got to be sharing of the prosperity when our economic system grows with everybody or it is very dangerous for the future of the world. You can't be a greedy pig and expect to live in a society where only you are benefiting and everybody else is not, without those people ultimately getting really pissed off.
Question for Chris. Like quoting you, you said that you don't greatly identify with Trump, maybe 40% or something. So what's, in your view now, the optimal strategy for Republican Party? Try to stay with him and risk everything, or maybe because most of them don't identify with him fully or partially, try to quit and salvage what can be salvageable still? Thank you.
Would you take that? No. Are you sure you can't take that? Oh, my Lord. You know, look, if I was advising Trump, and thank goodness no one has asked me to, you know, I said yesterday on Twitter, I said that the only way to deal with this is for him to have a press conference on Saturday morning and stay as long as he possibly, as long as the reporters wanted him to stay, and to answer every question, and to be abject in his repudiation of all of this stuff that came out on Friday. And if he doesn't do that, then it all remains part of the conversation for tonight, this big debate. Which it would still be in the debate, don't get me wrong, but at least he would be able to get his apology out there and try to make it stick. Now, obviously, the guy's video wasn't very good, and he doesn't seem to be apologetic, which only makes things more awful than they already were. So where do the Republicans, you know, we've got people who have withdrawn endorsements. We've got people who have asked him to step down, like Carly Fiorina and a few senators and governors and congresspeople. We're in uncharted territory, and he seems resolute, determined to proceed. Okay, we don't know yet, and believe me, I'm not accepting of any of this behavior or these statements. And I've got my own version of Hillary, and I disagree with Bob 97% of the way here. So I'm just not going through that whole litany. But he might still be competitive.
Yes.
He might still be competitive. And I want to say, I've spent a lot of time studying fascism years ago. I have a view probably that's different from Bob's, but I'm equally concerned about it. And I want to tell you that one thing, in case Trump wins, here is the less bad news. You have got dozens of Republican leaders repudiating Trump today. Now, is he going to win anyway? I don't know. I kind of hope that he doesn't. On the other hand, I don't want to see a world that Hillary creates. But and we're stuck with these two right now because of Gary Johnson not being a viable, in my opinion, alternative. So I think that Ryan, whose view of the world and view of the government is very different from Bob and Hillary's, but I think that Paul Ryan and the Senate and all of these Republicans who have repudiated Trump would severely constrict the guy, okay? I can offer that to you right now. That's not a hell of a lot. But I'll tell you, this is, we Republicans have got to be true to our principles, and we have to learn a lesson. Our Beltway participants, to this day, don't understand the reactions out here in the real world that led to Trump. And so our Republican establishment and the corporatists to whom Bob, corporate welfare for my wing of the party is an absolute anathema. And yet we have a whole Beltway crowd in D.C. who have learned nothing. And they are actually statist central government apparatchiks. That's who they are. And they want to continue to be right there at the intersection points to distribute influence and to get whatever money they can. There's a lot of that going on the Democratic side of this aisle. There's a lot of that on the Democratic side. There's a lot of that on the Republican side. So the Republican Party needs a reformation or a revolution or something, because this Trumpism and those elements of it that cause a friend like Bob to think in terms of Franco and Mussolini, this must be eradicated.
Well, and I'm not going to comment on the direction of the Republican Party exactly. I would say I agree with Chris in one critical respect. Don't take for granted that Trump can't win. It is absolutely, a couple of weeks ago, there was a referendum in Colombia on a peace deal with the FARC. Now, I'd been involved in helping to promote that this peace thing for a long time myself, actually, and all the polling showed that the deal would pass, and it failed. Everybody's huge surprise. Brexit, the exit of Britain, all the polling showed day after, oh my God, we're leaving Europe. Don't let that happen here, please. Everybody's got to get out and work, turn out to vote. Every place, that's the critical element here. Vote. If everybody votes, that's not going to be a problem. Yeah.
Thank you. I've done a lot of research, especially in the last 6 months, about the resulting fiscal impact on our economy from both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. And maybe the data is slanted, but it seems overwhelmingly so that under Democratic administrations, the stock market over the last 100 years has outperformed by at least double, I believe. Job creation, there's no comparison. Is that true? Can both of you speak to that?
Well, it's true. We used to say, if you want to live like a Republican, vote like a Democrat. The economy will be better under Democrats. There is little doubt that the record of Democratic administrations has been substantially better with respect to all of these issues. I mean, and this president, remember what he inherited was the total collapse of the economy. And we've had 72 months of continuous job growth since the first 6 months of administration, the longest continuous job growth in the private sector in the history of the United States. Now, and we're beginning finally to see some increase in ordinary people's incomes. But the fundamental problem of the income distribution in the United States has not been addressed in the last 8 years appropriately, and it needs to be, and that's not because the administration didn't want to. It's had a hard time with Congress. We've got to address those questions, or these dangers that we are seeing in this election will explode, in my view.
So my original training in college was philosophy and economics, and in economics they talk about the three gaps. So you have fiscal policy, and you have monetary policy, and you have a gap of recognition, a gap of enactment, and a gap of effectuation. And I cite that to reply to your question and say that economic history is a fascinating area. It was actually Milton Friedman's first area of interest. And I don't think that the currents of economic activity or results are easily ascribable either to one administration or to another. I don't think you can just sort of say cookie cutter, you do the Democratic thing, this is what you'll get, you do the Republican thing. Because what happens in a Republican administration carries over to a Democrat, what happens in Democrats carries over to Republicans. It's all kind of mushed in there, and we've got to do the best. The single defining characteristic of this era, and which makes it, in my opinion, the postmodern era of economic history, is that which Bob correctly cited at the beginning, and that is the influence of globalization on production and incomes. Okay, and so we've had an increase in production, and we've had an increase in the value of that production. So our GNP, gross national product, or GDP, gross domestic product, both of those big indicators have gone along pretty well over the last 25, 30 years. You know, the post-war era, we were just off the charts for the 50s and the 60s. And then the other countries around the world with whom we were trading began to compete with us. And that competition brought online countless laborers who were working in very different conditions and under very different regimes. So all the stuff that my grandfather started a labor newspaper in the 19th century in Central Illinois, first one in Central Illinois, and then he went to Congress. And he was fighting for all these kinds of protections for workers. Eventually, they all got into the U.S. Code, right? They all got into the U.S. Code. And very few of those protections obtain in Colombia or in, you know, Vietnam, right? So we're competing where we've got costs like this, and you can say there are imbalances. And this one of the impacts is what Bob reported to you, that you've got this increase in production, this increase in activity, but the working level, the working class, the middle class has seen stagnation over the past 15, 20 years in the purchasing power of its net disposable income. Now, this caused Bernie Sanders to say a lot of things about global trade. It caused Donald Trump to say a lot of things about global trade. They're actually a little closer together. Hillary said some things about global trade, but those are in conflict with other things she said about global. She said TPP is the gold standard. Then she said, I'm opposed to it. And I don't want to make political points here. I just want to say Bob's reference to the economic hardships of the Weimar era and which were the inflation of the Weimar era that led into the Depression of the 1930s is an apt backdrop, okay, for political alienation, right? And so what we are dealing with now, not just in Colombia's vote, but in the vote on Scotland, where all of the elites were wrong. The vote on Brexit, all of the elites were wrong. Any number of votes inside of Europe where the elites have been wrong, and the elites could be wrong here. People could rise up because their incomes are not increasing as quickly as is production and output. It's a very serious problem.
Okay, now we have a question from the balcony.
Hey.
Over the last 10 years, we've seen the Republican Party literally tear itself apart because we see terms like rhino, and then we see moderate Republicans and even liberal Republicans leaving. How, in this climate, are we going to continue having a Republican Party? Because again, we need both parties for this union to actually work.
You know, the Downers Grove regular Republican organization meets tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. I wonder if you'll come out and just start with that. I'll give you a ride. You know, I think that I wrote a series of articles on a website called Illinois Review about 6 years ago about the difference between establishment and reform republicanism, okay? And establishment republicanism is what we saw under, for lack of a better term, and I'm very close to both of these guys, Edgar and Thompson, but Jim Thompson showed you I think a good picture of establishment republicanism, and that is they get elected, they get in, and they've got their hands on the levers of power, and they're allocating benefits out of government, okay? Reform folks, if you want to hear a great reform story, go to Edgar County Watchdogs. Edgar County Watchdogs, write that down. Go to Edgar County Watchdogs. They're not even Republicans. These guys are not partisan, and they are investigating people, and their investigations have caused 250 public officials in the last 18 months to lose their jobs. They're going to be on 60 Minutes real soon, and you should see what they're doing because they're completely self-taught activists. And all they did, their whole thing was FOIA, OMA. Illinois Freedom of Information Act, Illinois Open Meetings Act. They took OMA, they took FOIA, they started the Edgar County Watchdogs, and they have uncovered corruption throughout the state in Republican areas and in Democrat areas. And one of the greatest examples is COD, College of DuPage. Any of you remember the big problems at College of DuPage? Let me tell you something. The corruption out there was unlike anything I'd ever seen in the city of Chicago. And I was the commissioner of elections in the city of Chicago. I'm a Republican. I lived downtown forever. And I know corruption when I see it. It was worse at the College of DuPage than it was downtown. And the entire, not the entire, almost the entire structure of the DuPage County Republican Party supported the gang who was manipulating the corruption. Because certain architecture firms were getting work, certain construction firms were getting work, certain graphics firms were getting work. All of them were recycling that into the Republican Party. Okay? And that is a cancer. Okay? I think that in Illinois, we're naturally a reform party because so many of Bob's friends have gotten us into such terrible situations.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about the Republican Party and how it needs to reform itself. But I do want to just quickly respond to this comment about the economic inequality, the causes of that, real fast. I don't disagree that when there are 600 million Chinese who need to be absorbed into an industrial economy from the rural areas, and that's if there is a completely open ability to have them compete with people who, in the United States, they'll work for a lot less money, and that causes wages to drop. That's one of the reasons we have labor unions. That's one of the reasons we have trade arrangements that allow for economic integration that moves things to the top, up, not down. The EU was a pretty good example of that, except for a couple of its flawed kind of its monetary policy. We won't get into the weeds on that. But I think it's possible to integrate economies by bringing the bottom up, not the top down. And that's where that's the kind of trade deals we ought to have. But it starts out, the reason why Hillary Clinton is against TPP right now is not because even of the trade aspects. It's because it empowers corporations with these things called investor-state resolution programs that allow a bunch of corporate lawyers to make decisions as to whether or not a country's laws have cost a bunch of people who are companies money, and then to fine them huge sums of money. I mean, it makes the pharmaceutical industry very happy to not have to compete with generic drugs. I mean, it creates all these things these are things, by the way, the United States, our trade rep has insisted on, not the other countries. I mean, that's the reason TPP should be defeated in the lame duck. I hope it will be. Anyway, and we start over fresh. We have to have worldwide economic integration, but we have to do it so that it raises incomes around the world, not so it brings everybody to a low common denominator. One final thing on that. In the 1970s, there started a major attack on the labor movement. The labor movement proceeds upon the assumption that markets are good for distributing a lot of things, but one of those things is not simply pay. You got to have the ability to negotiate on an equal playing field with these huge corporations. And in the United States, 35% of the private sector workforce was unionized in the 1950s. Today, it's like 7, 8. That's one of the reasons we have incomes that have not gone up. And we haven't had minimum wage go up nationally. That's why the fight for 15 in a union is so important. There are solutions to these problems. Let's not make the mistake of believing that they are somehow acts of God or of international economics, and they're immutable.
One last short one. Talking about we all thought it was going to be the electric car resurgence in the 90s. Turns out nobody invested in it. Nothing happened. Right now we're seeing tons of investment within multiple corporations in multiple sectors in driverless vehicles and the potential loss of up to 40 million American transportation jobs, which make up a lot of that the middle, lower class positions. I'm curious, your perspectives, is this something that we haven't talked about much Is this going to be a huge issue that we have that's coming our way in the next 5 years to 10 years? And how does that affect from each of your perspectives?
Go ahead.
Okay, a couple brief answers, please.
All right, just real brief. Increasing productivity is not the enemy of working people. Really. That's where our economic growth comes from. It's not. That somebody doesn't have to do stoop labor is not a bad thing.
Right.
The question is, how do we assure that the benefits of increased productivity are shared equally by ordinary people? That's where things like the minimum wage come in. That's where things like reinvesting in education and infrastructure, and that's where things like assuring that cab drivers, to the extent they exist, don't have to compete with everybody in the world and make decent middle-class incomes. Democrats, I hope, believe in high-income economy, because higher the incomes are, the more people have money in their pocket, the more they'll buy, and the more people will invest. There's a virtuous cycle that results. That's been the reason why the economy does better under Democrats and Republicans. Republicans generally believe in a low-income economy, where the supply side, you give the money to rich people and it'll trickle down. Good luck.
I do not belong to a country club.
Okay.
I want to say technology is our friend, and the more that we're involved with it, the better. But from my standpoint, I believe that government bureaucracies and bureaucrats are ill-suited to making allocative decisions with respect to things like, should we invest in solar panels or should we invest in driverless cars? I don't think that the top graduates of Stanford Business School or whoever it is that you think makes good investment decisions, those people do not go to the U.S. Department of Transportation for a job. If you want society to benefit from technological advances, and believe me, all of us do, whether you know it or not, but you do, then I think those decisions are best made out in the private sector and not by the government.
It's a mix. Remember, the internet was invented by the government.
You've already answered, right? Okay. Time for just a couple more questions. It's hard to pick. There's so many hands up. I'm sorry.
Real quick. My name's Ken, and I like Nixon in 72 as well, but I'm a Democrat, just so you know. Anyway, real quick. Something passionate. I've been real passionate about for 25 years is the abolishment of electoral college. Just wanted to know what your guys' views on changing the way we vote and apathy, as you pointed out earlier, with Europe and all the other places, and even now, okay? Very important, right? So why don't we, I don't know, let's get progressive and, give a tax credit for somebody that votes, an electoral year. I'm throwing that out. Why don't we get creative? That's all I'm saying.
I love that idea. I also love the idea, by the way. The Governor Rauner, vetoed a measure this cycle, this session, that would have required, would have universal voter registration. The idea that why shouldn't everybody be automatically registered to vote? It's the government's obligation to make sure they find you. They do it for taxes. They can do it for voting, and then that, of course, is the case in a lot of countries. And some countries, of course, have mandatory voting. Their voting turnout's much higher. I like the incentive-based system a little better. I like that. That's a good idea.
Yeah. What was the other? You had the voting thing, and which was the other one? Oh, the Electoral College. Look, if you're in New Hampshire right now, you're seeing Hillary and Donald Trump because of what Bob said, that Trump could still win. If you're in Iowa, you're seeing Hillary and Donald Trump. If we abolish the Electoral College, the issues that are significant to your average Iowan or your average New Hampshireite, or in some future election, it might be, a small state, like West Virginia or something, you know what I mean? Those issues remain front of mind for Hillary and for Trump because of the Electoral College. So I think it's easy to sort of, first past the post has got its own issues. which are being debated right now very hotly in the UK, just by the way. So I don't know. I kind of like the fact that you've got to go all over the place to get yourself elected. I'm not opposed to universal registration if, as an election administrator now, if there is, if eligibility is part of the registration process. Sure. Okay, if eligibility is, and no Republican, I've never met a Republican who supported voter ID because they wanted to suppress the vote. Our position on voter ID is we don't want to dilute the vote, okay? And as an election administrator, I can tell you, dilution is equally onerous and obnoxious to society as is suppression. I'm not a suppressor. I registered voters in 50 wards. And out of 3,000 precincts, I think I visited almost all 3,000 at one point or another. So you got to have, nobody wants suppression, but nor should anybody allow dilution. Thank you.
Well, and voter IDs, by the way, are kind of a solution in looking for a problem. You know, there's no evidence of any in-person voter fraud in the United States I'm aware of.
There are 3 times to steal an election: before, during, and after. And we'll have a little seminar during coffee.
Okay. This will have to be the last question because our Sunday school children will be getting out, and their parents, some of whom are here, will have to rescue them. Last question.
Bring us all together.
Oh, lucky me. It's merely a question for Bob about Obama's apparent support for the TPP and why, with so much Democratic opposition to it and Clinton's own stated opposition to it, what is the problem and what can we do to prevent him from passing it?
Well, I've worked with the White House on a lot of the issue campaigns, and this is the one I disagree with him on. The president would tell you it's because the United States needs to structure the rules of the economic game, the trading game, particularly in the Pacific, and not have China do it. And it's and that there are, but we're not going to change the president's view on the subject. When they lost in the House at first, I actually tried to negotiate a deal between the AFL-CIO and the White House on because the AFL-CIO was happy to have a trade deal. They just wanted one that was fair. But then they, of course, won on the TPA, the fast track stuff. The way to defeat it is to defeat it in the lame duck. I mean, to prevent the votes. And I think we have the ability to do that.
I have to say, the TPP is actually very, very significant to all Americans, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Conservative, Liberal, and whatever. And this is a point of disappointment. Okay, it's an area of disappointment with respect to President Obama. Once upon a time, we were going to have a reset with Russia, and we were going to have a pivot to Asia. Okay, I don't think the reset went very well. This is part of my litany about Hillary that I spared all of you because I know you like Hillary. But the reset with Russia didn't go particularly well, and the pivot to Asia was founded on this new trade deal that was going to strengthen our relationships with our allies over there and kind of put China a little bit in a different spot. Okay, and you know what? As an American, President Obama came up with this. I'm like, okay, let's do it. Let's go, go, go. And unfortunately, this thing got, sort of off into the bureaucratic maze. And now, you saw on his trip to Asia, I mean, I think it's pretty well understood in Asia that the president was promising something that he has not yet been able to deliver. And he may not even deliver. And if he does not deliver, it's not going to change anybody's daily life. We're all going to go to Starbucks. We're all going to. But if we do not get TPP through in this lame duck, the United States, and unfortunately President Obama, who I know all of you support very strongly, but President Obama and the United States are not going to look good in Asia. We are going to look like we promised, we got them into this. They came down the road with us, and then when it was crunch time, we could not make it stick. So this is a very thorny issue, and if you're a Democrat, if you like Hillary, there's a lot to learn there about where Bob is and where Obama is and where Hillary. I happen to be supporting President Obama on this one. There you go. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.